Good evening. I'd like to call the regular meeting of the February 24th, 2021 Planning Commission of the City of Palm Springs to order. Can we have a roll call, please?
Present.
I'm here, but I'm having a hard time hearing you, Joanne.
Present.
Here, but I can't hear you very well.
Present. Can I have an acceptance or a report on the posting of the agenda, please?
You missed Commissioner.
Posted in accordance with state law.
Can I have a motion to accept the agenda?
I make a motion to accept the agenda.
Is there a second?
I'll second it. Paul Lewin.
Can you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Song,
Yes.
Commissioner Lewin,
Yes.
Commissioner Irvin,
Yes.
Commissioner Hirschbein,
Yes.
Vice Chair Maruzzi,
Yes.
and Chair Wilwick.
Yes. We are at public comment, and I'm getting an echo, so if staff has their mics open, it might help with the echo. If you could mute yourself. We're at public comment. This is a time set aside for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on consent calendar and other items and items of general interest within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Commission. Please note that the Planning Commission is prohibited from taking action on items not listed on the posted agenda. 3 minutes will be allowed for each speaker. Testimony on public hearings may be offered at this time or at the time of the hearing. Members of the public who would like to comment on item 5A are directed to comment under this portion of the agenda. Are there any members of the public who would like to speak? Assistant Director Newell, do you have any members who have requested to speak?
No, Madam Chair, we have not received any requests to speak via telephone, but if there's anyone on the Zoom call who wishes to speak at this time, now would be the appropriate time to unmute your microphone and provide your testimony. Otherwise, if you're here to speak on the public hearing items or public hearing item 2B or 2A, you may do so at that time.
There being no members of the public who have requested to speak, the public comment section is closed. We have no items on the consent calendar. We have 2 public hearing items. Item 2A, request by Evolved Engineering LLC on behalf of Morgue LLC for a conditional use permit to operate a type 6 non-volatile cannabis facility to include manufacturing, cultivation, dispensary distribution, and a lounge in a vacant industrial building within an existing business park located at 1241 South Gene Autry Trail. Staff report, please.
Madam Chair, staff would request to continue this item to the meeting of March 10th, and so we would ask for a motion to continue. Thank you.
Can I have a motion to continue?
I'll move to continue.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Commissioner Song, can you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Lewin,
Yes.
Commissioner Song,
Yes.
Commissioner Irvin,
Yes.
Commissioner Hirschbein,
Yes.
Vice Chair Maruzzi,
Yes.
and Chair Wilmot.
Yes.
Okay.
Item 2B is the request by the City of Palm Springs for approval of the annual update of the Palm Springs zoning code. Staff report, please.
Madam Chair and members of the Commission, as you'll recall, we discussed this item at your previous Planning Commission meeting. At that meeting, there were questions on two issues, and I'd like to focus my presentation this evening on those two issues. The first issue was relative to a change to the P professional zone. What we had proposed is to modify the approval process for restaurants, banks, and fitness facilities as accessory uses from a conditional use permit process to a land use permit process. In doing that, there were concerns about the impact of that change by no longer requiring a conditional use permit and a public hearing. Let me just offer some additional considerations to take into account as you consider this. First of all, it is in the ordinance that the restaurant use must be an accessory use. So we wouldn't see a situation where there is a standalone or a restaurant as a principal use. Secondly, drive-through uses are not allowed in the P professional zone, and so there wouldn't be a situation where we would see a fast food restaurant with a drive-through in the P professional zone. And then the third thing to take into consideration is when you have restaurant uses in an office district or in an office zone, typically those restaurants rely on the foot traffic of the office uses, and it's rare to see those have hours that are different than those of the office uses. If you've been to any type of a business park, I can think of a couple of examples, San Diego in one, where there are restaurants in an office zone. Again, they typically close at about the same time as the office uses. You won't see those go late into the evening generally. And so based on that, I think those are some considerations you need to be aware of. Also, let me speak just briefly in terms of the general approval procedures for restaurants in other commercial and multifamily zones, just so you have a point of comparison. Restaurants are a permitted use in most of our commercial zones and also in the M1P, which is an industrial professional zone. The restaurant use does require a land use permit in the central business district, so in our downtown area, requires a land use permit, which is an administrative permit reviewed and approved by staff, and then also in the M1 and M2 industrial zones. The only zones where restaurants require conditional use permits currently are our multifamily zones, R2, R3, and R4, where the restaurant is accessory to a hotel use, or in the P professional zone. So currently, those are the only zones where restaurants require a conditional use permit. And so what we're proposing is to make a change and allow the restaurant use in P professional zones by a land use permit in line with the central business district and the M1 and M2 zones. As I had mentioned at our last Planning Commission meeting, we see P professional zoning in essentially 4 areas of the city. The Desert Regional Hospital area, on East Vista Chino, east of Sunrise, in the area around East Tockwitz and Farrell, and then also in the East Ramon Road corridor. Let me go to a blow-up of those areas just so you can see the associated zoning around them. In the area around Desert Regional Hospital, We have a couple of small sites that are zoned P Professional Office, one to the south of Desert Regional at Tachiva Drive, and then one right across the street. In those situations, those parcels are generally surrounded by other commercial parcels. We also have an area just immediately to the southeast of Desert Regional, which is zoned PD. I'm trying to point to that on my map right now. That area references the P zone for its list of permitted uses. So if you were to make that change, the restaurant use would be permitted within that complex upon approval of a land use permit. That is one that does back up to an R1B single-family zone. However, there is a parking lot that separates that commercial complex from the single-family residential. Looking at the area on East Vista Chino, this is an area where you do start to see some single-family residences that back up to the P professional zone. However, there aren't really many office complexes in that area, and so you wouldn't be able to do a restaurant here as the principal use. So for the most part, you wouldn't see restaurants going in this particular area. In the East Tahquitz Canyon and South Farrell area, you do have some professional zones that back up to residential. For example, here in the area around the Vibe development, the multifamily units in Vibe back up to 2 P professionally zoned parcels. There is the area on South Farrell. It's unlikely that you would see restaurant uses go into those office complexes in that they don't really have a desirable location for a restaurant there, just based on the configuration of the properties. You do have office uses here at Tahquitz and Sunrise, just behind the commercial uses there. They tend to back up to R2 multifamily zone properties, although there is one complex here on the north that is across the street from single family. And then looking in the Ramon Road corridor, you have offices on the south side, or P professional zone properties on the south side of Ramon. And so in that area, primarily you back up to multifamily properties. There is also the charter school that some of those office complexes or office uses back up to there. And then there is an area here where the professional zone is immediately adjacent to an R1C zone. So that goes into the specific areas of the P professional zone. And then again, looking at the proposed change in that use, we would make it similar to the land use permit process that we do in the Central Business District in M1 and M2 zones. Moving on to the next topic in terms of allowing residential uses in the resort corridor overlay and not requiring a conditional use permit to do that. Again, the intent of this was to facilitate the development of housing and reduce barriers to the development of housing. As we question why this might be important, one of the things to understand is that under the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, which we are subject to, during the next 8-year cycle, the City of Palm Springs will be responsible for accommodating the development of approximately 2,500 new housing units over an 8-year cycle. What that requires us to do to comply with this state requirement is to identify sites where housing could be developed. As you can understand, that's been a bit of a challenge for us in order to do that. Also, the other thing to take into consideration is there have been changes to state law which necessitate the elimination of barriers to housing, and one of those barriers is discretionary actions like conditional use permits. And so that's the reasons that we're looking at this as something that would be desirable to do. As we talk about the Regional Housing Needs Assessment and the fact that the City of Palm Springs needs to be able to accommodate 2,500 new housing units, as part of our general plan effort to update the housing element, We are in the process of identifying sites. In looking at this map, this is one of the maps that we will be forwarding on to our General Plan Steering Committee, and then ultimately you as the Planning Commission in terms of reviewing the changes to the housing element. We are noting the need to look at some of our commercial corridors and the availability of housing sites within those corridors. As I had identified in our last Planning Commission meeting, the resort overlay zone primarily follows Palm Canyon as it goes from north to east in the city of Palm Springs. There is also an area within the Section 14 Section 14 specific plan on East Tockwitz Canyon, where we have a portion of the resort overlay, and our specific plan addresses the uses in that area. In terms of trying to get a little bit more finely detailed on this, what I'd like to do is look at the North Palm Canyon corridor in terms of where this may be appropriate and why a conditional use permit is not really necessary within this particular area. So looking at the North Palm Canyon corridor between Tramway Road on the north and East Vista Chino on the south, the area within the dotted line is the resort corridor overlay within that specific area. As we look at the parcels that are colored blue on that map, those are existing hotel uses or proposed hotel uses within that corridor. So you'll see that there is a healthy number of hotel properties that are already established in that corridor. This is a portion of the area that we're looking at where there are a number of vacant parcels that could lend themselves to housing. And just to point out, the yellow or orangish parcels that you see there on the map, those are areas where housing is already in existence. So we have the new Icon development on Palm Canyon. We have Tangerine Court, which is a number of condominiums there on the south portion of the map. And then we have the condominiums at Tramway Road on the north portion of the map. So looking at this corridor, there are a number of vacant parcels there that I don't foresee that will need additional hotel uses. There are already commercial uses within this corridor, and so we probably already have enough commercial uses within the corridor. And so this is one of the areas where we would see benefits to relaxing the discretionary review requirement of a conditional use permit to encourage the development of housing in this area. So again, going back to the two questions that you had from the last Planning Commission meeting, the appropriateness of changing the approval process for restaurants in the P professional zone, and then the elimination of the conditional use permit requirement to encourage the development of housing in the resort corridor overlay. So that concludes my presentation. This is a public hearing. We do have one member of the public who would like to speak on this. And so, Madam Chair, I will go ahead and turn this back to you.
At this point, before I take questions from the commission, I think I'd like to open the public hearing, and then we'll go to questions and comments. If there's a member of the public who'd like to speak.
This is Scott Timberlake. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just cut me off because I tend to go on and on. Basically, I think that how I got really involved in this is I, as you know, have Captor Plaza, and I just purchased a building at 2825 East Tockwitz, really close to the City Hall. And what I've learned basically from other cities, I lived in Waikiki for 10 years, which is very much a resort town. And then I also lived for 20 years in Portland, Oregon. There's a real sense of a lack of neighborhoods in Palm Springs. And I don't necessarily mean for housing. This is where people that live here full time or spend a lot of time here, they really don't want to go to Starbucks downtown and sit with all the tourists on the corner of Tockwitz and have to deal with parking. So a good indication of some progress is Capture Plaza. I currently have coffee there, and I also have the V Wine Lounge, which is a wine bar, and both are doing extremely well pre-pandemic. I mean, we've certainly had a lot of challenges. But what you created is a place for not only the office tenants to go to, but people that don't want to go downtown. I'm one of those people. So I like to go to coffee, but I would go to the coffee on Camino Real before I would go to the Starbucks downtown. And also, there's a real resistance from people that live there full time that want that community walk to feel that you get in downtown. So in Portland, Oregon, I think they're the perfect example of way out of control. They have, they're much easier with having coffee shops and apartment buildings and high rises and condominiums. But Portland's always had that eclectic environment. I think the building at 2825 that you're probably familiar with on the East Tuckwitz corridor with a blue roof and a big fountain in front is one of those perfect spots. Recently with Vibe, you've added a whole lot of new housing. Also, the East Tuckwitz corridor houses most of the apartment buildings in Palm Springs down the East corridor, most of the 2-3-story buildings and apartment people that live here full time or are living there. In Palm Springs, we have such a shortage of apartments and new development and affordable housing that rents have gone up tremendously during this pandemic, as well as housing prices. But if you're one of those residents and you're at the new Vibe or you're across the street or even you at City Hall, so I can use that as an example, if you want a cup of coffee, where do you go? The airport you can't get into unless you're checking someone in for a flight. People go to the airport constantly. People are late. People are early. There's no place for them to sit, no place for them to hang out without paying parking fees. And to add a coffee shop just like coffee to that building at 2825, it creates a sense of neighborhood where the people at Vibe, a large population of apartment dwellers across the street, can go to and sit outside. That particular property I bought has an amazing outdoor space around the big fountain. I'm tearing out a bunch of shrubs now and doing landscaping and, just making that patio space. And I can tell you confidentially, because it probably won't be confidential very long, Townie Bagels is very interested in taking over that site. They're currently on Sunny Dune, if any of you are familiar with them. They have a kitchen that cannot meet their needs. They have lines out the door that sometimes can be a half hour to an hour.
Madam Chair, we're at 3 minutes.
Okay.
Anyway. What I would like you to do is sum up for us, what are you asking us to do?
What I'm basically, I'm not sure I'm asking anything. I'm praising you for the ability to have another outlet other than the conditional use permit. As you know, I did a conditional use permit at Capture Plaza, and we did what I thought was the first blanket conditional use permit where small businesses could come in, doctors, whatever, and get this. I was applying for the conditional use permit at 2825 for the coffee shop to be there. And then I was told that the council was considering this land use option. I still will proceed with the conditional use permit, so it wasn't necessarily a financial holdback, but it's months and months away and takes a lot of time. And I just think if we can take some of these office buildings that are really dead down Tuckwitz Corridor, Ramon, that people have to get in their car to drive to get a cup of coffee or anything to eat, we can make more community. So I'm just favoring the land use change and would really hope that office buildings like the one I have and others that my clients have, could have that opportunity to put in a coffee shop or some tenant services or neighborhood services, not full restaurants. That would really help, I think, the locals living here, and that's about it.
Thank you so much for your testimony.
Okay.
Are there any other members of the public who wish to speak? The public hearing is closed and the matter is before the commission. Commissioner Song, and your sound is off.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question and a comment. For the overlay, for the hotel overlay in the corridor, Palm Canyon corridor, when a multifamily housing project is proposed, they will still have to follow the zoning of R2 or the zoning that exists there with the general plan. That's the question for our director. But the fact that when housing comes in, it still needs to follow the zoning requirements that are for that area. And that's to clarify the fact that it won't be higher density. It will be the density that is allowed by the zoning code. And second is to the restaurant removing the conditional use permit. One of the reasons that I am in favor of that is because the current business complexes are overparked and there's quite a bit of asphalt areas. So they're not tight quarters in which public access will be difficult. So that will be one of the reasons why I will also support allowing for businesses to flourish in office complexes which are in need of more flexibility.
Commissioner Song, is that a motion?
It was a comment. I would like to hear what others have to say, but yes, I am leaning towards the motion.
Madam Chair, if I could respond to Commissioner Song's question about housing in the resort corridor overlay. The answer is yes. The multifamily housing would still be subject to the zone district in which it's located in terms of development standards. Keeping in mind the city zoning code does have a density bonus ordinance, but they'd still be subject to the provisions of that ordinance. So basically what it's doing is just removing the requirement for an additional application. What they would need to do is submit their major architectural application and be subject to the development standards in place.
Commissioner Lewin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, my mouse had moved away from the mute button. I've got a couple questions for Flynn on this. Flynn, if we did this is about the resort overlay portion. If we got rid of the CUP requirement, how many dwelling units could be created through the LUP or through a regular process? You said we needed 2,500 dwelling units roughly to meet our housing goals. What I'm trying to understand is what percent of that 2,500 would be, I guess, allowed for housing development with this change? And there's a reason for my question.
So as I had shown in the map, there's a number of vacant parcels, especially along the North Palm Canyon corridor, that might lend themselves to housing opportunities. So what that does in terms of, again, reducing barriers is makes those parcels more available to the development of housing. Obviously, as we've already mentioned, they have to have the zoning in place to be able to do that and conform to development standards. I would say that looking in our major corridor areas in terms of a percentage, it's a relatively small percentage. I wouldn't say that it's more than 15%, but still trying to meet those 2,500 units with the vacant available parcels that we have is going to be a challenge. And so we really need to look at all opportunities that we have for housing.
So in your estimation, not even 500 dwelling units would be affected by this?
I wouldn't anticipate that we would have more than 500. You're correct.
Okay, so for the benefit of my commissioners, the reason I was asking that is I want to make sure that if we take this action with the resort overlay, that we don't click off a box and say, well, we've allowed enough development to meet the housing goals and never actually focus on how we're going to do housing. That's why I was asking that question. So I will be probably okay with that part of the proposal, and especially if we're going to be intentional and look for infill development opportunities like shopping centers that are really designed and ready for this kind of the housing needs that we have in our community. Then the other thing that I'm really struggling with is the restaurant in the professional zone. To me, it doesn't seem like it's too high of a bar to ask a restaurant to go through a conditional use permit, because there are lots of things that go with restaurants that are not compatible with professional or nearby residential areas. And they include the food waste and garbage, grease traps, smoke, cars, music, alcohol. And I want to see places like Capitol Plaza thrive. I want to see professional places thrive. But I don't think that this is the place to say we can just not worry about the impacts of restaurants. It's okay to have a public hearing and make sure that the particular place that someone's going to actually open a restaurant has had a full review, and we've identified and mitigated the community needs. So I'm not really convinced, and I respect Flynn a lot, but I'm not really convinced by the argument that, hey, a restaurant that's going to be in a professional office area is really only going to be open from 8 till 5. I think if I'm a restaurant operator, I'm going to want to make as much money as possible and do my best job as possible. I think the CUP process makes sense for restaurants in the P zone. I'm totally fine with the banks and the gyms. So, thank you, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Hirschman.
Yes, I'm going to echo Commissioner Lewin's comments, actually, so thank you. I, too, am okay with allowing residential in the resort overlay areas. I think it's appropriate. The uses are roughly similar. People sleep there. I don't know. But I agree that a restaurant, I mean, not every restaurant owner or operator is as diligent as Mr. Timberlake, who's done great work in our city, and we're a better city for having an active participant here. But they're not all like him, and that's not why zoning codes and so forth are written. They're written for sort of the lowest common denominator, if you want to call it that. And I do think we need some oversight on restaurant uses. I mean, I could, and I'm not talking just about adjacent to R1, multifamily residential would be impacted as well. But if you could imagine buying or renting a habit, where you live, and you look out, you see an office use, and you think, oh, this is going to be quiet at night, or this is going to be quiet, relatively quiet. And then all of a sudden there is an active restaurant right outside your back window. That's not fair to the people that have made their homes there. And I would want to give those people a chance to voice their concerns in a public testimony. So I wouldn't, unless there's some compelling reason to approve it, I would not approve sort of by right that you can put a restaurant in these office zones. I just think it's unfair to the residents that live adjacent to them.
Commissioner Maruzzi, and then I'll call him on myself.
What is the added, this is, I guess, a question for Flynn. What is the added burden of the CUP? Is it cost? Is it time? Is it all those things? I mean, what is the added burden to potentially a restaurant, moving into or trying to move into an office building?
It's both the issues of cost and timing. So with a conditional use permit, the cost of a conditional use permit with the notification fees is approximately $8,500. And then there's the time frame to do it. It would take generally about 60 to 90 days to process the conditional use permit, to meet the notification requirements, et cetera. In terms of a land use permit, the cost of a land use permit is approximately $1,500. It's processed administratively by staff. Similarly to a conditional use permit, a land use permit has conditions of approval, so we're able to restrict the hours of operation, deal with site plan issues, parking issues, et cetera, through the conditions of approval of a land use permit. Land use permits we can generally turn around in about 2 to 3 weeks.
Just speaking on this, I'm going to make a motion that we approve the changes, and I think the LUP process is sufficient for protection. I don't think that we need a CUP process here. I do think that restaurants are they're not it's a tight business, and lots of restaurants go under. Those costs up front are huge costs. I do think staff, we don't have a process in most zones where we even require an LUP for a restaurant. We have a couple of zones where we do, including the downtown, and this would require an LUP. I think it's sufficient, and I have no problem with the rest of the changes. So I'm going to make a motion and see where we go with it. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Is there any comment before we call the roll? Commissioner Lewin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to get a little clarification from staff. If there was a large office building in the professional zone, could every single unit of that professional zone ultimately become a restaurant?
No. The language in the code requires it to be an accessory use. So no more than 50% of that complex could be restaurants or something other than office. More than 50% of the complex would need to be office uses.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Commissioner Hirschbein, you had a comment?
Well, it's sort of a question. Could you build restrictions into the code, like size of a restaurant in a P zone or hours of operation in a P zone? So it's built in, distance away from residential. Can we build those in to a change to the P zone vis-a-vis the CUP, LUP issue?
Yes, you could, but realize that there wouldn't be any flexibility from those standards once they're adopted as part of the ordinance.
Commissioner Irvin, did you have a comment, or can I call the roll?
No, the same question that Commissioner Hirschbein asked, I was going to ask about the size. See if we can put a cap on the size, or he basically said it exactly what I was going to ask.
Okay. Could we call the roll on this?
Oops. Chair Wermuck?
Yes.
Commissioner Song?
Yes.
Commissioner Irvin?
Yes.
Commissioner Lewin?
No.
Oops. Vice Chair Maruzzi?
Yes.
And I think that's it.
I think you haven't called Commissioner Hirschbein.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leave you out. Commissioner Hirschbein?
No.
Okay.
The measure passes 4-2. Moving right along. We have no unfinished business. We have no new business. Item 5 is a discussion item, and it's the completion of our discussion on the changes to the architectural review process. And what's before us are changes, suggested changes to any of the specific plan districts. Before we start listing the specific plan districts, we have the college district the downtown district. Help me with the rest, Flynn. I do believe we have a district in the Indian Canyons.
We do. Sorry, we do. That was one that I didn't put on the list. There is a need to update that document, as we've discussed in the past. In terms of its requirements, it doesn't reference a specific process other than referring back to the zoning code, so I don't believe it would necessarily need to be amended for design review process. The other two plans are the Desert Palisades specific plan and then the Section 14 specific plan. So those are the ones that would be impacted in terms of this discussion.
And the downtown. I think we had a little bit of discussion about the downtown in our previous discussion about having either separate meetings with planning and AAC or a joint meeting, preliminary meeting just for discussion and study. Did you take away enough from that to come away with recommendations?
Yes, I did. Based on your comments, what we would look to do is, as a separate process, amend the downtown specific plan to change the approval process for development within that specific plan based on the comments that you've outlined in terms of a joint pre-application meeting with Planning Commission and AAC, and then following the remainder of the revised process.
And in Desert Palisades, my understanding, would that come underneath the hillside, the changes we made with hillside?
We would need to amend that specific plan as well to make modifications. What I would recommend for Desert Palisades is much like the hillside areas, that AAC would be sufficient in terms of the review process for Desert Palisades.
Does anybody have any problems with that? I'm seeing heads nod. I'm not seeing any problems. And in section 14 is the one that I'm least aware of what the process is or when we have a section 14 specific issue.
What I'd recommend for the Section 14 specific plan is that we use the same process as we are proposing in terms of the revisions to the architectural review process. With the Section 14 area, there is a number of parcels that are tribal trust land, and so they're not subject to our zoning ordinance or our processes, but the remainder of it is, and I think using the standard process that we set up would be appropriate for the Section 14 plan. So review by the Planning Commission first, and then the Architectural Advisory Committee.
And with the same standards that come under Section 14?
Correct. It would be subject to their design standards that we have adopted in that plan.
And so no changes with the Indian Canyon specific plan because that needs to be revised anyway?
Correct.
And no changes to the college plan because it would be impacted or it needs to be revised?
Correct. It doesn't specifically reference a process other than referring back to the zoning code. I do anticipate that we might have some minor changes to the College Park specific plan here in the near future based on changes with the College of the Desert site.
Okay. And those would be land use changes. Okay, so I think Commissioner Hirschbein, are you playing with your pen or do you wish to speak? That wasn't a request to speak. Okay. Commissioner Song?
So what I'm hearing is that it's the downtown specific plan, which is going to have a little bit of a different process. Is that correct? And can I have the outline again of what that process would be for downtown specific plan?
Based on your discussion, we would initiate the process with staff and then go to a joint pre-application meeting of the Planning Commission and the Architectural Advisory Committee. They would then submit their formal application. It would go to Planning Commission, then City Council, and then AAC would finalize the architectural review.
Thank you. Is that a joint meeting? Is that a version of a study session, or is it an official meeting?
It would be a study session, and so there wouldn't be formal action taken. It would be the opportunity for both bodies to offer comments on the proposed development. Keep in mind that as we talk about amending the specific plans, we won't be doing that as part of this action, but we would do it as a separate action that would follow afterwards. And then you all would be able to discuss those changes as part of a public hearing.
And then we also said Desert Palisades would change to, I guess all the others, the extent they have review plans in them would match what we're doing with the rest of the plan. So Desert Palisades would follow what we're doing with Hillsides.
Correct. That's the direction that I have from you.
Commissioner Lewin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to ask Flynn, if we make the change to the process, do we have to change the specific plan so that they're in conformance with the new process, or is it still discretionary because there is an existing specific plan?
You don't need to change the process. You can continue to use the process that's outlined in the specific plans where they do outline a process, or you have the option of changing it. The one benefit of changing it is that you have a consistent process through, all areas of the city. But again, it's up to you all as the Planning Commission and ultimately City Council in terms of whether or not you decide to change the process for each of the specific plans.
And Madam Chair, can I follow up with Flynn, please?
Mm-hmm.
I totally get that we would want a consistent process. My question then, Flynn, is if I'm somebody that owns land in that specific plan area and now the process has been changed, is there any danger of a kind of unlawful taking of rights or anything like that we accidentally would do?
No,
or simply a process?
I'm going to say no, that there isn't, but Mr. Priest has just come on, so I'll let our attorney go ahead and respond to that question.
Thank you, Flynn. Madam Chair, members of the Planning Commission, good evening. No, a legislative change to a specific plan going forward of this nature is not going to result in any sort of takings liability. We're pretty confident on that.
Okay. That's great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I think, Flynn, you have the direction you need.
Yes, I do, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Does anybody have any additional comments? I think this item is finished. Next item in front of us is Planning Commission reports, requests, and comments. Are there any?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to bring up two things and see if there's any support or interest on the Commission for this. We talked quite a bit about reducing barriers to restaurants opening in the city. And one of the things that I've known from living here is that there's a parking mitigation fee in downtown that is extremely high. And Flynn, do you know what the parking mitigation fee is for if you wanted to open a restaurant in Palm Springs, the cost per spot?
Yes, if you are changing the use of a building from one that requires less parking to a restaurant, which typically requires more, for an existing building, that fee is approximately $2,500 per parking space. We also offer that same program in the Central Business District area for new construction. For new construction, I believe that fee is about $14,000 per parking space.
Yeah, so we're not here to really make policy, my fellow commissioners, but I know that's one of the biggest obstacles to people taking some of our buildings in the downtown district. They might get hit with a $200,000 or $300,000 parking mitigation fee, which is far more than an $8,000 conditional use permit. And if we want to reduce barriers, the city now owns, which it didn't own 10 years ago, 1,200 spaces of parking in the downtown district. So I would just like to throw that out, that we should ask the council, I guess, if they want to get rid of that parking mitigation fee. I don't believe it's used to actually build parking in any way. I don't know what gets done with it, but that would eliminate barriers. And then I'm just going to keep bringing it up. I'd love to see us have a housing opportunity subcommittee get together and really identify where the next 2,500 dwelling units would be best located for the city of Palm Springs. That would be such an honor for us to really thoughtfully plan where these new housing units could be built in our city. I hope we can start a subcommittee at some point in the future. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you on that. We are going through you'll have a chance to look at that. We're going through the general plan update, the housing element update. And a piece of that update is always identifying sites. And if there was a subcommittee that wanted to work on that as we go through that element, looking at the recommendations of the consultant and the general plan steering committee, I think that would be appropriate. We may be a little ways off from that, but there's some opportunities, and there were also some questions at our last meeting to staff about whether incremental, smaller sites can add to that mix. I think Commissioner Irvin mentioned allowing duplexes or fourplexes on some of the vacant lots in Desert Highland. There are proposals like that in the legislature, but there are also proposals that haven't really been thought through for various areas of the city. But that is going to be coming before us.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, it was Commissioner Irvin's comments that made me realize I've got ideas of where housing could be, but he's got really good ideas of where density could exist. And that's where I've been thinking of us being intentional and part of the process. What I'm hearing from you is we will be able to be part of the process.
We may, and I think what maybe we can do is I can talk that through with David and Flynn before our next meeting and just figure out when that's going to come to us and what role the commission can take.
Could I ask a follow-up, Madam Chair?
Yes.
So sometimes policies are developed and they're handed to us to kind of vote yay or nay. Is it good or is it bad? And sometimes there's just a need for a couple of people to really do a whole bunch of diligent work and drive around and identify things. And that's my sense of what a smart future housing opportunity vision would look like, is really, really doing some hard on the ground work. And do you think that's going to happen, or do you think it's going to be all done at the staff?
Get back to you. I mean, right now, the city's hired consultants who are doing some piece of that, but some areas, some major areas are being looked at. One of the areas is where the College of the Desert was originally going to go to, which is why the area of the College Park, and how that whole area gets zoned for housing, and issues and ideas like Commissioner Irvin's last time. In fact, there were some national articles written that kind of matched what Commissioner Irvin was thinking about. But what I'd like to do is talk that through, or possibly we can make that an agenda item for our next meeting so we can see what the possibilities are of working with what's currently going on with the housing element. Because we do have statutory, I think we have deadlines on the housing element. So if we're going to do this, we need to work in conjunction with that.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners.
Commissioner Marizzi, and then Commissioner Song.
Wormack, I recall last time that you had brought up the idea that we'd get an update on projects in the city. Would that be at each planning commission meeting? I'd like to know, I think the public would like to know what's going on with all these projects, instead of me having to ask about specific ones every time. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think that, weren't you the one that brought it up as something you wanted to see?
One question is to Flynn, is our software sufficient that we can do that?
Not really. Not at this point in time with spreadsheets. We don't have an electronic software system yet.
Well, Mayor Coors, when he was mayor, would ask for this information on a regular basis. I guess staff had to pull it all together, right?
Yes, it takes a great deal of time for us to go through. When Mayor Coors did that, it was on a quarterly basis at a city council meeting. For us having to go through each and every project and contact the applicant to see where they are with their funding, parts of the project that we don't deal with in terms of our responsibilities. It takes a lot of time to do that and to put a PowerPoint together to do that. One of the things that I would refer you to is we do have our interactive map of projects on the Planning Department webpage. That I would refer people to that in terms of projects.
And what information is available on that?
It has the entitlement information and typically whether or not they have building permits pulled for it.
I was thinking maybe of the top 5 projects, but anyhow, the ones that continuously are raised, the major projects that are so visible in our city. So I'm not going to drop this issue. I don't know how we're going to figure it out, but I'd like to know what's going on. I think the public would too.
To the director, has Mayor Holstage asked for the same information?
Not that I'm aware of.
I mean, at a minimum, if it is requested by City Council, could it also be provided to us?
Absolutely.
Okay, that answers that. Thank you.
Commissioner Song.
Yes, Commissioner Lewin, you speak to my heart when you talk about flexibility and creative usage of parking areas for additional housing. The way I would approach this is that in a more sort of practical way, it's to take a survey of projects like shopping centers or even dense housing in which the projects are designed with over-parked spaces and utilize under-parked. And the reason for that is because in the zoning code, it requires a minimum number of parking spaces, but many designers or engineers, they pride in creating more spaces than what is required. And if we don't have that information, then by the time we come up with this idea that we can install housing, those housing will require parking. And it could create challenges on how to program and use the spaces in a very efficient way. So the idea is that if we can see how the projects that have been in full use, how have the parking spaces been used, and what areas are really not used by parking, that will create the vacant spaces to create housing. However, when the housing is being proposed, that new housing is going to require parking spaces requirement based on current zoning code. And therefore, it will challenge the creativity on how to house and provide the parking spaces that are needed. So before we can get into this idea or parallel to the idea of creative zoning, I think we need to understand how the car parking requirements versus how it's actually practically utilized needs to be understood. Thank you.
Madam Chair, may I?
Yes, but before we go further with this, I think we might want to agendize this for our next meeting as a discussion.
Sure.
Are you going to the same topic?
I was just going to thank Commissioner Song for her comments, and I would love to, I think it takes two people to put an item on the agenda, right? So do you need a formal kind of motion? I would love to see this agendized for discussion of how to find housing opportunities in the city of Palm Springs.
Why don't you make a motion to agendize it? That way we know it will get on our next agenda.
Madam Chair, I'd like to move that we agendize a discussion of how to find housing opportunities in the city of Palm Springs.
Do I have a second? Can you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Irvine,
Yes.
Commissioner Hirschbein,
Yes.
Vice Chair Maruzzi,
Yes.
and Chair Wehrmuck.
Yes.
Okay.
Are there any more reports or planning commissioner comments? If there are none, can we have the planning director's report, please?
Madam Chair, I have no items to report.
Thank you. It is 7:05, and I would like to adjourn our this planning commission until 5 p.m. on Wednesday, March 10th, 2021.
Madam Chair, correction, 5:30 p.m.
Oh, sorry, 5:30. I was going to make us speak earlier. Okay, 5:30.
Thank you.
It was great seeing everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Aye.
Bye-bye.